I remember the day I first visited Morningside Groves, a picturesque neighborhood that boasted gently rolling lawns, clusters of young pines, and a winding creek that meandered into a nearby woodland preserve. After years of living in a bustling city, I yearned for open spaces and a chance to reconnect with nature. Morningside Groves, I hoped, would offer tranquility. As I drove in, I passed a tasteful sign. Morningside Groves, harmony with nature. It seemed perfect for someone like me, Dr. Nicole Hammond. Most people in the neighborhood wouldn't know my profession, not at first. I am the director of the National Animal Protection Authority, NAPA, a federal agency that oversees wildlife conservation initiatives, endangered species protection, and the safeguarding of habitats around the country. My day-to-day often involves policymaking, oversight of local conservation efforts, and traveling to conflict zones where wildlife corridors are threatened by development. But I rarely reveal such details in casual conversation. I wanted Morningside Groves to be my peaceful respite after a busy workday, not a place where I was constantly on the job. I expected the neighborhood to reflect the harmony with nature promise. Indeed, the development bordered a stretch of forested land and a designated wildlife corridor where deer, foxes, raccoons, and even occasional bobcats roamed. Residents here often spoke of glimpses of wildlife at dusk. Children giggled about spotting rabbits nibbling at clover. It all sounded idyllic, until I discovered that not everyone treasured this closeness to nature. Within days of moving in, I encountered Brenda Farnwood, though I soon realized everyone secretly called her Karen behind her back. She was a middle-aged woman, meticulously styled hair, and a stern expression that rarely softened. As treasurer of the Morningside Groves Homeowners Association, HOA, she seemed to believe she wielded absolute authority over the neighborhood's governance. On my second evening, while I was strolling near the creek to admire sunset reflections, Karen emerged from a golf cart, brandishing a clipboard. She marched toward me with an air of self-importance. "You must be the new resident," she said, a polite but tight smile on her lips. "I'm Brenda Farnwood. Call me Karen. I handle compliance and finances for our HOA. We run a tidy ship here. I trust you've familiarized yourself with the bylaws." I nodded, carefully. "Yes, I read the binder. It's quite thorough." She scanned the environment around us. "We have strict standards to keep property values high and preserve our curated aesthetic," she explained. Then her gaze flicked to the tree line. "And we're especially mindful about controlling nuisance wildlife. Some residents feed raccoons or stray animals, which is against the rules. We don't want pests overrunning us, do we?" Something in her tone made me uneasy. Nature wasn't just pests to me. I valued the delicate balance of ecosystems. But I brushed it off, hoping it was just her officious manner. Little did I know how her hostility toward wildlife would soon escalate, threatening not only local animal populations, but also the fundamental integrity of the entire wildlife corridor, and forcing me to reveal my professional identity in a dramatic standoff. Within a week, I explored the edges of Morningside Groves more thoroughly. The highlight was a small but significant wildlife corridor, a protected passage stretching from the deeper state forest to some wetlands on the other side of town. Over the years, local conservation groups and the municipal government had worked out easements ensuring animals could migrate through certain parts of the suburban sprawl. This corridor allowed deer, foxes, and even rare amphibians to cross under roads and traverse yards with minimal human conflict. I was delighted to see posted signs reading, "Wildlife Passage Area, Preserve and Protect." They reminded residents to keep fences wildlife-friendly and avoid blocking the natural pathways. Some neighbors even had motion-activated cameras in their backyards, capturing images of playful fawns or sly foxes at night. But not everyone welcomed these animals. During a casual chat, an older couple confided that Karen had recently complained about animal intrusions messing up landscaping. She's tried to rally the HOA to install more fences or barriers, they said with a sigh. "We keep telling her the corridor is protected by local ordinances, but you know Karen, when she fixates on something, watch out." That alarmed me. My own professional background taught me that wildlife corridors are often fragile. Even a few misguided acts, blocking a crossing, building fences that hinder migratory paths, can disrupt an entire local ecosystem. And if Karen convinced the HOA to sabotage it, the consequences could be devastating for the animals. At that stage, I kept my identity low-key, though my worry grew. Morningside Groves, ironically, boasted harmony with nature, yet I sensed a looming conflict. I decided to quietly gather information. If Karen's plan was indeed to block or damage the corridor, I'd have to intervene. Possibly, I'd do so discreetly, but if she persisted, I could invoke Napa's authority. After all, this corridor likely involved threatened species or protected habitats. If push came to shove, I wouldn't let her bulldoze wildlife rights unchallenged. Over the next month, subtle changes occurred along the corridor's edge, near the backyards of certain Morningside Groves homes. One morning, out for a walk, I noticed that a section of low, wildlife-friendly fencing had been replaced by a tall, solid barrier that extended nearly to the creek. This new fence lacked any cutouts or open spacing that deer or foxes could pass through. It looked suspiciously like something designed to block large animals entirely. Another day, I saw freshly posted signs reading "Private Property" and "No Trespassing." The misspelling of trespassing made me suspect a quick, unapproved job. These were placed alarmingly close to the stream bank, an area previously left open for animals to reach water. Meanwhile, some residents complained on the neighborhood's social media page that they heard clanging or drilling at odd hours behind Karen's house. One posted a photo of large metal stakes being driven into the ground near the corridor path. Is the HOA reinforcing property lines or something? This will block the deer from crossing, commented a concerned neighbor. Another replied, Karen insists it's to deter pests and protect our community from rabies. But it feels excessive. It was becoming clear that Karen was orchestrating a stealthy plan to seal off parts of the wildlife corridor under the guise of pest control or protecting property values. However, the corridor was supposed to be under partial conservation easement, meaning major modifications required official permits or at least city approval. If Karen was bypassing legal channels, she was setting the stage for a significant conflict. At this point, I weighed the pros and cons of revealing my role as director of the National Animal Protection Authority. Exposing myself might escalate tensions, but ignoring these signs risked letting Karen solidify her blockade before the corridor's supporters could respond. In the end, I decided to gather concrete evidence first: photos, resident statements, local regulations, so that if she tried a bigger move, I could intervene decisively. My professional instincts told me the worst was yet to come. To better understand the corridor's legal status, I reached out to the Riverbend Wildlife Alliance, a local conservation group that had championed Morningside Groves corridor project years ago. Their small office stood on the far side of the forest, run by passionate volunteers who monitored local habitats, rescued injured animals, and educated the public about coexistence with wildlife. When I visited, the group's coordinator, Angela Perez, welcomed me warmly. She recognized my name from some national conservation circles, though I asked her to keep my official position under wraps for now. Over coffee, she explained the corridor's history. Decades ago, the city recognized that suburban sprawl was fragmenting habitats. We negotiated a patchwork of easements, including some in Morningside Groves, to maintain a continuous route for wildlife. It's not perfect, but it helps animals avoid roads and find safe nesting or feeding sites. She sighed. We've heard rumors that certain HOA members, particularly a woman named Karen Farnwood, hate the corridor. She's pressured residents to build fences or remove vegetation. If that continues, the corridor could be severed entirely. Angela showed me old maps and legal documents. Indeed, large swaths of backyards along the creek were designated as limited development zones, requiring permission for major changes. The corridor was especially crucial for a rare species of salamander that needed unobstructed stream banks to breed each spring. If blocked, the salamanders could vanish from the region. I shared my observations of the new fences. Angela's eyes darkened. We need to act quickly. If Karen's building an impenetrable barrier, that's illegal under the county's corridor ordinance. But enforcement can be slow unless we have compelling proof. And if she's cunning, she might couch it as normal property improvements. I promised to help. Though I withheld details of my position, I hinted that I had direct lines to higher-level environmental authorities if local measures failed. Angela seemed relieved. We'll rally the alliance members, gather more evidence, and contact the city's environmental compliance office, she said. Karen won't ruin years of hard-fought progress for these animals. We parted ways, determined to protect the corridor. I left with a sense that a confrontation was inevitable. Karen's arrogance and cunning made her a formidable adversary. She had already proven she'd act quietly and aggressively to reshape the neighborhood in her image. Wildlife be damned. A few weeks later, I attended an HOA meeting in Morningside Groves. The agenda included typical items, lawn care contracts, pool maintenance, but also a vague entry about property line enhancements. Suspecting that this referred to the corridor fences, I sat in the back row, quietly observing. The small crowd included a mix of retirees, families, and the usual board members. Karen sat front and center, documents arranged meticulously. After routine matters, Karen cleared her throat to announce, "We've had consistent complaints about wild animals encroaching on yards, leaving droppings, damaging gardens, and frightening residents. As treasurer, I propose we adopt stricter fencing guidelines around the perimeter to keep these creatures out. Safety must come first." One neighbor, Ms. Brown, spoke up. "But isn't that entire stretch legally designated as a wildlife corridor?" We agreed not to block the animal's path. Her voice quivered slightly, perhaps intimidated by Karen. Karen's eyes narrowed. "That was an old agreement from years ago, and times have changed. We can't let disease-carrying foxes or rowdy deer roam freely. Many of us have children or pets. We must protect them from potential rabies or ticks. The HOA can enforce new fence standards that align with modern safety concerns." I watched the board members exchange uneasy glances. The president, a timid man named Harold, gently reminded, "But we should verify with the city if modifying the corridor is allowed." Karen waved her hand dismissively. "I've looked into it. There's no active enforcement unless we do major development. A fence is a minor improvement. If certain groups want to preserve nature, let them buy their own land. Meanwhile, we keep our families safe." Before any formal vote, Karen pivoted to financial details, quickly overshadowing further discussion. By the end of the meeting, the board agreed to study the fence proposal, which likely meant Karen would proceed anyway. Ms. Brown cornered me afterward, fretting that few had the gumption to stand up to Karen. "She uses fear-mongering, like rabies, to justify ignoring the corridor. No one wants to be labeled as pro-disease," she said wryly. I assured her we had allies. Silently, I promised that if Karen tried to break local or federal conservation laws, I'd bring the full weight of my authority to stop her. The corridor, and all the creatures depending on it, deserved better than to be blocked for the sake of property values. Over the next few days, members of the Riverbend Wildlife Alliance and some concerned neighbors systematically documented the changes along the corridor's boundary. We found tall fences erected where open, wildlife-friendly boundaries once stood. No city permits were displayed. Cleared vegetation near the creek bank, removing brush essential for small mammals and amphibians. Signs telling people to keep out. HOA enforced, placed on old footpaths that animals used as well. Even more worrying, a neighbor reported seeing small wire snares or traps hidden in tall grass near Karen's property line. If that was true, it wasn't just a fence. She might be actively harming wildlife. The neighbor took a quick photo from a distance, though not close enough to confirm. Nonetheless, it pointed to a potential escalation from mere barrier building to direct harm. Meanwhile, Karen bragged in the community's online forum about progress in wildlife deterrence, boasting how fewer raccoons were spotted rummaging in trash bins. She framed it as a community victory. Some residents, unaware of the corridor's ecological importance, applauded her. Others posted outraged replies, condemning her sabotage. Karen responded with snide remarks, labeling them tree-hugging alarmists. It was clear we needed to act. Angela at the Wildlife Alliance requested a formal city inspection. However, city staff indicated their backlog was high. "We'll investigate soon, but it might take a few weeks," an official said apologetically. Encouraged, Karen likely felt emboldened. She was gambling that local enforcement moved too slowly to stop her from completing the corridor blockade. Unwilling to wait for city bureaucracy, Angela and I prepared a comprehensive file of evidence, photos, witness statements, references to the corridor easement. She also quietly reached out to the state wildlife agency for advice. Meanwhile, I readied my own next step. If Karen continued to escalate, I'd have Napa directly intervene. That kind of federal involvement might shock the HOA board, but sometimes a strong hammer was necessary to defend precious natural habitats. One evening, just past midnight, a neighbor named Robert frantically texted me. "There's commotion near the creek behind Karen's house. Loud banging, floodlights. Looks suspicious." Concerned, I pulled on shoes and hurried outside, sneaking across the moonlit yards toward the corridor area. Sure enough, I heard hammering and saw bright lights shining from Karen's backyard. Careful not to trespass, I crouched behind a row of shrubs with Robert. We glimpsed a small work crew, likely hired by Karen, installing heavy metal panels along the creek bank. They were driving them deep into the ground, forming a barrier that would effectively cut off the stream from open land. If completed, no large animals could pass from the forest to the wetlands without encountering this wall. The amphibians needing stream access would be blocked, potentially crushing breeding sites. I took pictures with my phone, zooming in to capture the men in action. Robert whispered, "They must be doing this at night to avoid prying eyes." Karen's unstoppable. My anger flared. This was a blatant violation of the corridor's legal protection, and done under cover of darkness, proving ill intent. Emboldened, I stepped forward, shining my phone's flashlight. "What's going on here?" I demanded loudly. The workers paused, startled. From behind them, Karen emerged, face twisted in anger. "This is private property," she snapped. "Get out." I retorted. "You're erecting a structure that blocks a documented wildlife corridor. I have photos. This is illegal." She glared, voice hissing with contempt. "Don't lecture me. I'm protecting my property. That corridor nonsense is old news. Times change." I raised my phone. "I'm calling the local police to report unauthorized construction in a protected area. Also, the city will hear about this immediately. Pack up your materials or risk serious penalties." The workers looked uneasy. Karen glowered. "I have the HOA's blessing, so go ahead, call who you want." She turned to her crew, barking, "Keep working." Then to me, she spat. "This is none of your business. Don't meddle." But meddle I would. I rang the non-emergency police line. An officer arrived half an hour later, shining a spotlight over the scene. While he wasn't fully versed in corridor regulations, he recognized something fishy about a large steel wall going up at midnight without visible permits. He told Karen's crew to halt until they produced official permissions. Furious, Karen threatened to report him to the mayor for interfering. The officer shrugged, unimpressed. They eventually left, but the partially installed barrier remained. I went home fuming yet determined. If Karen wouldn't listen to reason or local police, I would escalate further. As director of Napa, I had no qualms about mobilizing a higher level of enforcement. She had crossed a line by physically destroying habitat that was likely under federal or state protection. Her arrogance would soon meet a formidable challenge. The next morning, I contacted the legal division of the National Animal Protection Authority. I explained that a protected wildlife corridor in Morningside Groves was being blocked. While it wasn't an internationally recognized refuge, local ordinances plus the corridor's importance for certain protected species, like that rare salamander, could warrant federal involvement. After reviewing preliminary evidence, Napa staff concluded it might indeed fall under their purview, especially if threatened species were at risk. My colleagues prepared a cease and desist order that could be served if local solutions failed. Additionally, they alerted the state's Department of Fish and Wildlife. At that point, I decided to break my cover in Morningside Groves. It was time to show Karen who she was up against. That evening, the HOA board held another meeting, an urgent session, presumably about the partial steel wall discovered by the police. I arrived with Angela from the Wildlife Alliance, both of us armed with documents. The room buzzed with tension as I approached the front. Karen, seated at the head table, glared daggers at me. I introduced myself, projecting a calm authority. "Board members, neighbors, I'm Dr. Nicole Hammond, Director of the National Animal Protection Authority. I regret not disclosing this earlier, but my professional role is directly relevant now." Gasps rippled through the audience. Karen's face blanched. I continued. "We have evidence that Ms. Farnwood is illegally obstructing a recognized wildlife corridor, violating local and possibly federal protections. My agency stands ready to enforce legal measures if this sabotage continues. The corridor is vital for local fauna, including threatened salamanders that depend on unobstructed stream banks." Karen launched into an indignant tirade. I've never heard of your so-called authority. We have private property rights. This is a scare tactic. You can't force us to harbor dangerous animals. I held firm. We can and will enforce laws protecting wildlife from destructive development. The corridor is mandated by local ordinances and possibly covered by state or federal statutes if threatened species are present. If you persist, you'll face steep fines, potential criminal charges, and we can forcibly remove any illegal barriers. A hush fell. Karen's eyes blazed, but the board members looked rattled. Ms. Brown, one of the more sympathetic neighbors, rose. If Dr. Hammond truly works for a federal wildlife agency, we can't risk ignoring legal obligations. We must abide by conservation rules. Leonard, the timid HOA president, cleared his throat. Karen, I think we should suspend your fencing project until we clarify the corridor's status. Others murmured agreement. Karen seethed but couldn't stop the momentum. I felt a surge of relief, though I knew she might try new underhanded tactics. Still, the truth was out. I had the power to defend the corridor formally. Under pressure, Karen grudgingly agreed to pause all new fence construction. The board said they'd coordinate with the city and state to verify where fencing was permissible. For a moment, it appeared Karen's blockade might be halted peacefully. However, less than a week later, local residents discovered more sneaky sabotage. Vegetation removal. Overnight, someone cut down brush along the creek, ripping out native plants that provided cover for small mammals and amphibians. Traps. A resident's dog got its paw caught in a snare near the corridor, prompting an outcry. The dog survived, but was injured. Floodlights. High-powered lights were installed along Karen's backyard, shining into the wooded corridor at night, likely scaring or disorienting animals. When confronted, Karen denied responsibility but said, "If others choose to protect their gardens from pests, that's their right. I'm not the only one fed up with wildlife." Many doubted her claims. Angered parents and pet owners demanded action. The city officials, spurred by repeated complaints, finally scheduled an official site inspection with the county's environment officer. Angela from the Wildlife Alliance accompanied them. I was at work that day but planned to meet them on site by late afternoon. Then tragedy struck. While the inspection team walked near the creek, they stumbled upon newly placed holes and covered pits, camouflaged in leaves. One official fell waist-deep into a pit, hurting his leg. Furious, they photographed it as evidence of malicious booby trapping. Word spread that the situation was no longer mere boundary disputes. It was a dangerously orchestrated effort to harm or deter wildlife, and evidently people. As the news of the booby traps circulated, even Karen's supporters in the HOA reeled in shock. One neighbor demanded an emergency recall of Karen from her treasurer position, but the board hesitated. She dominated them for years. Meanwhile, I alerted Napa's enforcement wing that physical hazards were endangering humans and wildlife. They responded swiftly. "We'll dispatch an investigation team. Keep collecting evidence." Karen, faced with intensifying scrutiny, doubled down publicly. She posted a rant on the HOA's private forum about government overreach, painting me as an outside threat wanting to dump diseased animals in their backyards. Some residents believed her fearmongering. Others recognized her desperation. The stage was set for a final confrontation. Late one evening, as I prepared dinner, my phone buzzed nonstop with messages from neighbors. The corridor is flooding, some kind of barrier causing water buildup. An intense thunderstorm had rolled in, dumping inches of rain. Normally, the creek drained swiftly into the wetlands. But apparently, new obstructions placed across the stream acted like a dam, causing water to back up. Some yards near the corridor risked flooding. Pulling on a raincoat, I dashed outside. Lightning flashed, revealing the creek's water level surging ominously. Indeed, someone had piled logs, metal sheets, and debris across a narrow bend. The rising water threatened not only the local houses, but also wildlife dens downstream, starved of necessary flow. Neighbors braved the downpour, yelling that Karen was behind it. There had been sightings of her dragging materials to the creek earlier. A father pointed to the newly stacked debris. "This is insane. She's so bent on blocking animals. She's risking flash floods." Ms. Brown wept, fearing her basement would flood from the swirling water. The entire corridor was an inch away from a major overflow. I grabbed phone pictures as evidence, then phoned local authorities. We have an emergency. A man-made dam along the corridor is causing a dangerous backup. The fire department arrived with a rescue truck. They used tools to dislodge logs and debris under the pounding rain. Water whooshed through the cleared path, averting a worse crisis. Still, significant damage was done. Some people's patios and landscaping washed away or were submerged. A stunned hush fell as we realized how close we came to a full-blown flood. If the blockade had remained overnight, multiple homes could have faced severe water damage, and local wildlife would have been devastated. Neighbors openly cursed Karen's name, fury blazing. Ms. Brown declared, "She's crossing into criminal territory. We can't let this slide." That night, I emailed my superiors at Napa, attaching photos of the makeshift dam and a timeline of sabotage. Enough was enough. I requested formal emergency intervention under federal wildlife protection statutes. Even if local law enforcement was slow, we could bring serious charges, harming protected species, illegally altering waterways, and risking public safety. We were done playing nice. Within 48 hours, a team from Napa's Enforcement Division arrived in Morningside Groves. Usually, Napa staff focus on major habitats or endangered species areas, but the blatant sabotage, potential involvement of threatened salamanders, and risk to human safety triggered a federal response. They carried official documents, prepared to serve a cease and desist order on the HOA if needed, plus potential personal notices to Karen. When the Napa officers showed up at Karen's door, she was livid. She ranted about property rights and accused them of trespassing, but they calmly explained their legal authority. One officer recounted the corridor's protected status under local and possibly state guidelines. Another officer pointed to suspicion that threatened amphibians lived in the creek. If proven, interfering with their habitat was a federal crime. They gave Karen a stern warning: dismantle any obstructions and refrain from further attempts to block or harass wildlife, or face immediate legal proceedings. Karen tried her usual intimidation. "I have powerful connections. This is an overreach. The government can't force me to host wild animals in my backyard." The officers were unmoved. They left a formal notice stating that Napa would reinspect in a week. If the corridor wasn't restored and sabotage ended, Karen and possibly the entire HOA would face lawsuits, injunctions, and potential criminal charges. The news spread like wildfire. The HOA board panicked, worried about ruinous legal fees. Leonard publicly apologized to neighbors for failing to rein in Karen. Many demanded a special vote to remove her from the treasurer's seat. Some, feeling betrayed, posted angry messages on social media. "Karen nearly flooded our homes. Enough is enough." Only a small handful still defended her, blaming government meddling. But they were drowned out by outraged families. Karen, cornered, retreated from the public eye. I heard rumors she was conferring with an attorney to fight the Napa order. But the broad consensus in the neighborhood was that her reign of terror was finished. If she tried more stunts, she'd face swift enforcement. Freed from her intimidation, many residents voiced relief that the corridor might finally be saved. Despite Napa's stern threat, Karen launched a final, desperate ploy. Late one night, again under the cover of darkness, a group of unidentified workers returned to the corridor's boundary with heavy equipment. This time, they started bulldozing a swath of vegetation, presumably to create a wide barrier zone or a drainage ditch that would further hamper animal movement. The rumble of machinery woke neighbors, who peered out windows to see swirling dust clouds and the harsh glow of floodlights. A flurry of calls bombarded the local police and Napa hotlines. By the time I arrived on scene, the bulldozer had cleared a 30-yard path of trees and bushes near the creek, uprooting vital habitat. Karen stood near the machine, wearing protective earmuffs, shouting instructions. She spotted me and roared, "Stay back. I have every right. This is my property, my land, my decision." I stepped forward, flanked by a pair of Napa officers who had rushed over. One officer demanded the bulldozer operator halt immediately. Another read from a copy of the cease and desist order, reminding Karen that continuing any further habitat destruction was a direct violation of federal directives. The bulldozer operator hesitated, uncertain, until Karen spat, "Keep going, or you don't get paid." But the operator, seeing the official badges, cut the engine in fear. An intense standoff ensued. Neighbors gathered, some filming on smartphones. The Napa officer calmly told Karen she was under investigation for willful destruction of protected habitat and violation of the corridor's easement. Her face twisted with fury. "You people can't override my property rights," she cried. "I'll never let these filthy animals roam free here. Never." The officer gave her one last chance to comply. Karen, trembling with rage, lunged at him, shrieking that she was sick of bureaucrats and tree huggers. The officer stepped back, prepared for a confrontation. Another officer tried to calm her, but she swiped at him. That was it. The officers cuffed her for assault and forcibly halted the bulldozing operation. Residents watched, stunned, as the woman who had dominated the HOA for so long was led away, ranting about conspiracies and reclaiming her rights. The corridor lay scarred with freshly uprooted trees. Some terrified animals scattered across the new clearing. But at least Karen's rampage had ended. I watched them drive her off, a swirl of conflicting emotions, disgust at her cruelty and relief that she'd finally face real accountability. By morning, news of Karen's arrest spread throughout Morningside Groves. Some residents were shocked she'd resort to physical violence. Others felt it was a natural progression of her obsession. The HOA board convened in an emergency session, promptly removing her from the treasurer position. The new leadership pledged full cooperation with Napa and local conservation authorities. Napa enforcement specialists taped off the damaged area as a potential crime scene for environmental crimes. Forensic ecologists arrived to assess the bulldozed zone, confirming the presence of sensitive species, including egg masses of the threatened salamander. The destruction was significant. Habitat crucial to the salamander's breeding had been torn apart. The discovery guaranteed that Karen would face serious charges under wildlife protection laws. Meanwhile, local media arrived in droves, turning the once quiet corridor into a spectacle. News vans parked along the street, interviewing neighbors about how an HOA official ended up destroying an animal habitat. Some residents expressed regret for not stopping her sooner. Parents held their children's hands, explaining the importance of living alongside nature. The story went viral online, fueling debates about HOAs overstepping their power and the necessity of preserving wildlife corridors in suburban America. I spent the next few days coordinating with my Napa colleagues and local authorities, ensuring the corridor would be rehabilitated. The bulldozed patch would need replanting with native species, and the partial steel wall installed earlier had to be removed. The city offered funds and volunteers pitched in. The Riverbend Wildlife Alliance led efforts to salvage any displaced creatures. Ms. Brown, the previously timid neighbor, turned into an enthusiastic volunteer, determined to help reverse the damage. Karen remained in custody, awaiting arraignment. Rumor said she was fuming, threatening countersuits. But with the weight of physical evidence, eyewitness accounts, and her assault on a federal officer, her prospects looked grim. Even her staunchest supporters recognized she'd gone too far. Freed from Karen's grip, Morningside Groves seemed united in a new purpose, to restore what she had nearly destroyed. The following weeks saw an unprecedented surge of volunteerism in Morningside Groves. Children, parents, retirees, and Riverbend Wildlife Alliance members joined together to clean debris from the creek, replant native bushes, and build discreet, wildlife-friendly fencing that guided animals without blocking them. The city provided small grants to help regreen the stripped land. Even some local businesses donated supplies or offered discounted tree saplings. The relief at Karen's removal from power was palpable. The new HOA board openly apologized for not reining her in sooner. They invited me to a special meeting, where they unanimously reaffirmed the corridor's protected status. The board also vowed to revise the HOA bylaws to ensure no future board member could single-handedly override conservation rules. As we worked side by side, sowing seeds and transplanting shrubs, neighbors expressed gratitude. Ms. Brown told me, "Your willingness to stand up to Karen gave us courage." Others said they'd always cherished the wildlife sightings but felt cowed by Karen's intimidation. Now, they wanted to truly embrace the motto, harmony with nature. The animals, for their part, gradually returned. A neighbor's motion camera captured deer tentatively crossing the newly restored patch. Angela from the Wildlife Alliance spotted fresh salamander egg clusters in a partially unaffected part of the stream. Though some damage was irreparable, nature had a way of bouncing back if given a chance. We all felt hopeful that, in time, the corridor could flourish once more. Meanwhile, Karen faced a mounting legal storm. Her arraignment brought charges including destruction of protected habitat, a federal offense under certain wildlife protection statutes, particularly if threatened salamanders were proven to inhabit the area. Illegal construction in a conservation easement, violating local and county ordinances. Assaulting a federal officer, a serious felony. Potential reckless endangerment related to the man-made dam that risked flooding neighbors' homes. She posted bail with difficulty, rumored to be using her retirement savings or a family loan. Upon release, she found her house under watchful eyes. Neighbors wanted no more midnight bulldozing. The HOA restricted her from using any communal funds or property. Some residents vandalized her yard with signs reading, "Nature, Karen," though the new board discouraged vigilante acts. Karen's attempt to countersue Napa for trespassing was swiftly dismissed by a judge who recognized Napa's clear statutory authority to investigate threatened habitats. She tried blaming the bulldozer crew for going too far, but the men insisted they followed her explicit instructions. Emails and texts from Karen, urging them to rip out everything that draws pests, sealed her culpability. Her attorney tried forging a plea deal, though the prosecutors, both local and federal, signaled they would not go lightly. The assault on an officer alone could result in prison time. The destruction of a threatened species breeding ground exacerbated her predicament. Observers predicted she might face years behind bars if convicted on all counts. Months later, Karen's trial commenced under intense public attention. Morningside Grove's residents lined up outside the courthouse, many wearing shirts that read, "Save Our Corridor." Media outlets reported on the lurid details: secret nighttime bulldozing, man-made damming, booby traps. Karen arrived each day looking subdued, no longer exuding the arrogant authority she once wielded. The prosecution systematically presented evidence: photographs of the steel barriers and fences, witness accounts of Karen ordering workers to dig pits and set traps, environmental experts testifying about the irreparable harm to salamander habitat, the forced backups of creek water that nearly flooded homes. The night Karen physically resisted a federal officer. Each piece painted a grim picture of her deliberate, reckless disregard for wildlife laws and community safety. The defense tried to argue she simply wanted to protect her neighborhood from rabid coyotes or aggressive deer, but no documented evidence supported those claims. Instead, the prosecution introduced Karen's own inflammatory messages in which she ranted about hating disgusting animals and wanting a perfect, creature-free neighborhood. I testified briefly, explaining the corridor's ecological importance and how abruptly closing it threatened multiple species. I refrained from personal attacks, but my professional authority left the jury with a clear sense that Karen's actions were more than ignorance. They were malicious and destructive. After a tense week of testimony, the jury deliberated for only a short time. They returned guilty verdicts on the primary charges: vandalism of protected habitat, assault on a federal officer, and illegal obstruction of a conservation easement. Karen's face drained of color as the judge read the verdict. The courtroom erupted in relief among corridor supporters. Sentencing was scheduled a few weeks later. At the sentencing hearing, the judge excoriated Karen for her blatant disregard of both human and ecological welfare. "Ms. Farnwood, your actions were not mere trespasses on your own property. They inflicted grave harm on a protected wildlife corridor, threatened your neighbors' safety through flooding, and culminated in a violent altercation with authorities. Such behavior cannot be excused under any pretense of property rights. You flagrantly violated established laws meant to safeguard our shared environment." The judge then delivered a stiff sentence: 2 years in federal prison for assaulting the officer and willful destruction of protected habitat. Hefty fines to cover the cost of habitat restoration and to compensate neighbors for flood damage. Seizure of certain assets, including her property, if she couldn't pay restitution. The judge explained that since her sabotage caused substantial financial harm, her home might be confiscated and sold, with proceeds going toward corridor restoration. Karen stood in silent shock, tears on her. In Karen's absence, Morningside Groves underwent a transformation. Freed from her repressive influence, The HOA board organized volunteer squads to maintain the corridor properly, clearing debris, installing gentle fences that guided animals without blocking them, and planting beneficial flora. With guidance from the Riverbend Wildlife Alliance, they replaced invasive plants with native species to encourage pollinators and strengthen the local ecosystem. Neighbors started appreciating the nightly parade of deer or the occasional fox sighting. Ms. Brown, now an enthusiastic conservation advocate, worked with a local nursery to distribute wildlife-friendly shrubs to residents. The creek recovered, salamanders slowly repopulate their breeding sites, and the barrier illusions that once threatened to sever the corridor were removed. No one forgot Karen's dramatic downfall, but they treated it as a cautionary tale. The new HOA leadership revised the bylaws, ensuring that any significant property changes near sensitive areas required an open community vote and a professional environmental impact review. The motto, "Harmony with Nature," now resonated more authentically throughout the neighborhood. I continued living quietly in Morningside Groves, grateful that the community overcame its darkest chapter. My official role at Napa remained, but I was no longer forced to hide it. Locals often teased, calling me the neighborhood's wildlife guardian. I'd smile and remind them it was a collective effort. If not for the determined stand by neighbors, the Alliance, and local authorities, Karen might have succeeded in decimating the corridor. Months turned into a year. Morningside Groves found a remarkable new harmony. The corridor's once damaged section regrew lush and green. Young deer frolicked in the twilight, raccoons rummaged harmlessly at the forest's edge, and people learned to secure their trash better rather than trying to exterminate the animals. Birdsong thrived, and residents reported sightings of rare woodpeckers and owls returning. The media occasionally revisited the story, labeling it the HOA Karen saga, discussing how a single individual's destructive obsession was thwarted by a determined community and a strong legal framework for wildlife protection. Ms. Brown and Angela wrote a short article for a local environmental journal, praising the rally of neighbors to safeguard nature. Karen's name seldom surfaced now, except as a cautionary note about ignoring laws and moral responsibilities. Meanwhile, in federal prison, Karen served her time. Rumors said she was bitter, blaming everyone else for her downfall. Her property was sold at auction to pay restitution. A young family who cherished the corridor's nature purchased it. They replaced any leftover fortress-like fences with tasteful, wildlife-friendly landscaping. In a symbolic gesture, they set up a small memorial plaque near the creek, dedicated to the resilience of nature. One sun-dappled morning, I strolled along the corridor's newly installed boardwalk, a gentle path designed to let residents admire the creek without disturbing the habitat. I paused to watch a family of deer quietly drinking, then bounding away at my slight movement. The sense of peace and balance moved me. Morningside Groves had come precariously close to losing this precious link to the wild. Yet it prevailed thanks to collective will. On my way back, I passed Ms. Brown planting flowers near the plaque. She waved me over. "It's lovely, isn't it?" she said, gesturing at the blossoming area. "It's been a journey, but I think we came out stronger." I nodded, recalling the nights of sabotage, the frantic phone calls, the bitter confrontations. "Yes, quite a journey," I agreed. "But the community rallied, and the corridor is here to stay." She smiled. "Thank you, Dr. Hammond, for standing up to Karen when no one else could. Without your influence, we might have lost all this." I placed a hand on her shoulder. It was a team effort. And truly, nature belongs to all of us. No one person has the right to destroy it for petty reasons. As we parted ways, a hawk circled overhead, the sun illuminating its wings. I felt a swell of hope. Hope that more neighborhoods could learn from Morningside Grove's example, balancing development with respect for the wild creatures who share our world. Karen ended up with her property confiscated and found herself behind bars for her reckless, destructive actions. Morningside Groves, meanwhile, emerged from the ordeal with a renewed sense of stewardship. The wildlife corridor, once threatened by a single arrogant individual, stood as a testament to the power of community and the unwavering principle that nature's well-being cannot be dismissed or silenced. And as for me, I left behind any illusions of purely private life. But I gained something far more rewarding: A profound reminder that my role in wildlife protection was not confined to distant forests or grand preserves. It lived in the everyday choices of neighborhoods like Morningside Groves, where humans and animals must find ways to coexist in harmony.